woke up in a birthing sack, panicked and choking on amniotic fluid. I clawed at the fleshy walls, fighting with all my terrified strength to free myself. With a wet, ripping sound, I was dumped onto the muddy cobblestone of the street below, twisting my ankle as I landed. Hello, everybody. Before we get into the story, I wanted to mention a few things. I haven't been posting this last month because at this point, there is little that will make any difference. I can protest that I am a victim. I was always a victim, the same as everybody, but I can't ask for your forgiveness. I'm recording this to tell you how it happened. That won't matter either. It's the only thing I can do at this point, so it's what I'm doing. I found the guitar in an old pawn shop in Boston. The proprietor was a caricature of a pawnbroker, a bent little old man with a hooked nose and wisps of white hair around his ears, his face creased with a permanent frown from too many years of feigning disgust with the stuff people brought in. I didn't bother speaking to him at first, just walked up and down the narrow aisles between the shelves stacked with endless junk. I thought people brought their valuables to pawn, but this guy had somehow acquired piles of rusty old hand woodworking tools, random glassware and salt shakers, chipped china, and flatware that wasn't silver. I felt curiously drawn to a battered old wardrobe that looked like it had been built of leftover tongue and groove siding. I almost opened it, but I was sure it could only be filled with mink coats. Judging from the rest of his stuff, probably moth-eaten mink coats. I felt his eyes glued onto me, waiting for me to try to lift something. With my mohawk and torn jeans, I often got that look, but given the worthlessness of this crap, it was almost insulting. I said screw it and headed for the door. "Can I help you with something?" It was 3 a.m. on July 17th, 2004, when I found myself outside the site of the 7th murder in 4 weeks. My partner, Jim McAllister, and I had been the first responders to this particular incident, the first two to survey the carnage before the forensics team and cleanup crew made it to the scene. We had followed a twisted breadcrumb trail of broken glass, debris, and blood up to the master bedroom, where we found the mutilated body of the occupant, torn in half and adorned with tattered linen and ruby-tinged goose feathers. Her name was Sally McMahon. She was a 74-year-old woman who, according to her neighbors, lived alone and seldom had any visitors. There was no reason for anyone to have so much as let their dog run amok through her garden, let alone kill her, yet here we were. We had ruled out the idea of it being an animal attack after the first victim's post-mortem. A local farmer who we had found torn to pieces in his ransacked kitchen. Initially, we had put it down to being a bear or even a particularly aggressive wolf, but that was before a spooked-sounding forensic pathologist from the local hospital called in to Sheriff Alverson's office to gravely relay to us that the bite marks found on the farmer's body were thoroughly baffling. Allegedly, the corpse was covered with human teeth marks, and more alarmingly, teeth marks that were deemed unrecognizable. We had all hoped that the following incidents, when they happened, wouldn't turn out the same way, that they were animal attacks or that the post-mortem would yield different results. Of course, even by the 7th murder, some officers who were on the scene were still throwing around the idea that these were all just the work of one very aggravated bear. I had been standing outside the house, taking long, frequent drags on a cigarette and listening to the chatter of the other officers as the faulty streetlight above me played a fierce tug-of-war with the night. The detective assigned to the case, Donald Evans, emerged from the doorway and began to walk towards me, his face ashen even in the molted orange glow.
"Officer Lemansky?"
Call me Mikhail," I said, extending my hand out to shake his. "You're Detective Evans, right?"
"Yeah, that's me. It's my understanding that you were one of the first responders."
"That's right," I said, my words muffled by the smoke that exited my mouth in a ghostly wisp.
"I get that these incidents are uncommon around these parts, to say the least. But I need you to tell me if you or Officer McAllister noticed any details that stood out from the other crime scenes."
I forced my mind to delve back into the last hour and a half. Jim and I had entered the house at around 3:10 a.m., firstly noticing an upturned cabinet and broken glass strewn at the bottom of the staircase. Upon reaching the landing, we found yet more ravaged furniture and broken glass, and more than that, a thick crimson trail of blood that led into the master bedroom. My mind drew a blank. It was gruesome, but nothing that really stands out from the other. The handprints. There were handprints on the ceiling, I said.
What?
Evans nearly choked. There were bloody handprints on the walls and on the floor, but there were some on the ceiling too.
You're sure they were handprints?
Evans stammered. Sure as I am that we're having this conversation right now. Bloody handprints. Pronounced, too. Wasn't like the perp threw the victim up there or anything. You can go and check for yourself.
How did... Shit!
Evans jogged back to the house and disappeared up the stairs. I looked over at Jim, who had been sitting on the hood of the car and staring into space ever since the forensic team had got there. The case was weighing on him, I could tell. With each passing incident, he grew quieter. His mind was on something, though. The handprints on the ceiling had thoroughly frightened and confused the hell out of me. All the murders up until this point had been grisly, but none had really possessed any anomalous details aside from the lack of fingerprints and the bizarre teeth marks, both of which we were all used to by now. I was about to attempt to make conversation with Jim when Evans rushed back out of the house. He looked even more somber than he had before, almost sickly.
You were right about the handprints. We're gonna take samples and see if we can identify the perpetrator from that.
He was almost choked up. Right. I didn't have much hope for that. No attempts at DNA fingerprinting or blood sampling had progressed the case at all in the last 3 weeks.
The forensic team are saying the corpse is covered in bite marks.
Human?
Probably. We'll have to wait for the post-mortem. Could still turn out different. We don't know yet.
We knew all too well. Evans spoke with the same vain expectation that the other local officers did, and it was becoming apparent that there was no way to downplay this as something less serious than it was. There was a person out there doing this, someone who was savagely butchering people, seemingly without reason. These were serial killings, yet the words serial killer had yet to be used by our sheriff or even Detective Evans.
You and McAllister can head home,
Evans said, defeat lurking behind his gruff, authoritative tone.
It's been a long night and the forensics team will be here for a while.
I wished Evans good luck in the hunt for any further evidence and motioned to Jim to get in the car. I looked back at the house as I turned the vehicle at the end of the street, knowing that soon the dawn would pull the obsidian shroud from the street, and the townspeople would waken to yet more unanswered questions. A week later, my exhausted brain was jump-started one slow morning by a phone call whilst I was at my desk. I didn't recognize the number. Mikhail Lemansky, who am I speaking to?
Hi, Mr. Lemansky. This is Alice Corman from the Jefferson Herald. I was wondering if you had any additional information on the ongoing investigation into the string of murders in Torkton?
Her words were a shot of adrenaline that went straight to my head.
Or perhaps any clarifying comments on today's story that could make it to a later publication.
How the hell do you know about this? How'd you get this number? I barked sternly.
3 days ago, we received detailed information about a series of killings in Torkton. Do you read the newspaper at all, sir?
As if on cue, the most recent copy of the Jefferson Herald was slammed down in front of me by the exasperated Sheriff Alverson. The bold headline perched arrogantly atop the cheap, fragile paper. Terror in Torkton, the Sawney Bean Murders. I looked up at Alverson's scowl and then spoke into the phone. Excuse me for a minute. I ended the call immediately and set the phone down. I perused the article with growing disgust, already put off by the tasteless reference to the Scottish cannibal in the headline. The article read, in the early hours of July 17th, Jefferson County Police were called to the scene of a suspected home invasion, only to be met by a grisly discovery, the mutilated, cannibalized body of Sally McMahon, 74. This is said to be the seventh in a string of similar horrific incidents that the authorities have been keeping quiet, as not to frighten the citizens of Torkton. Looking further down the page, I saw my last name appear, as well as Jim's. I looked up at Sheriff Alverson in shock. "What the hell is all this?" I exclaimed. Alverson's steely gaze persisted. "I was hoping you'd know," he said dryly. My mind raced. "I never told the press shit. I know that this is the kind of stuff they love to sink their teeth into, especially around here when nothing happens, and..." A thought popped into my head. Jim. He had left his gun and badge on Alverson's desk the day after the 7th killing, and no one had been able to contact him since then. I couldn't think of anyone else who would have tipped off the press about this whole ordeal, because no one else at the scene, no matter how harrowed, had been quite out of their minds as Jim was. It seemed like the ever-irate sheriff had read my mind. "You think it was McAllister?" "Looks that way. The only other person who would have been liable to let any information escape the scene was the lady who called it in, and we made a point not to give her all the details after finding out about the bite marks. We spared those details from past witnesses too." "Well, no one in this fucking precinct has heard from him since last week's incident, and no one has been able to contact him. Is he married, Lemansky?" the sheriff asked. "No. Kids? Girlfriend?" "He lives alone, Sheriff," I said, my voice descending into an unimpressed monotone. Yeah, Jim had just up and left. His personality had been melting away ever since that case was opened. It wasn't like him at all, but Alverson was, and always had been, an uptight, neglectful son of a bitch. In the 8 years that I'd worked here, he'd never once made a real effort to get to know me, or any of the other officers for that matter, despite the fact that he had very little else to do. Perhaps he had a chip on his shoulder because he was laid off from a big shot position in Seattle or something, but it's not like his dismissive, cold self would ever tell me that story. I knew what was about to come out of his mouth. "Well, Lemansky, you know the dipshit better than anyone else here, so it falls on you to pull him out of wherever he's holed up and talk to him." "With all due respect, Sheriff," I said, almost gagging on my words. "What would I even say to him? The papers have already printed." Alverson cut me off. "You tell him whatever you gotta tell him. Have him head down to the Jefferson Herald and tell him that forensics screwed up, that it was an animal attack. I can't have these bastards making us look like we aren't handling this, so they're gonna pull that goddamn story right now. This is a quiet town, and I don't want the fucking Hoover boys down here. Cannibalism. Jesus Christ." Alverson was perhaps the only human being in the world who still used the term Hoover boys to describe the FBI after 1969. There was a joke about his ever so confidently spoken, outdated lingo amidst the officers, unbeknownst to him. I shot up from my desk, unwilling to tolerate the unanswered what-ifs of the situation. "Sheriff, what if they don't pull the headline? What happens then? What if they don't retract their statements?" Alverson, ever angry, stared at me with an expression that suggested that he was about to blow his top again. He shook his head as his mind attempted to come up with some kind of solution. "Right, we interview every single person above the age of 16 in Torkton. We get officers out here going door to door, demanding mandatory questioning for every man, woman, boy, and girl above 16. They can tell anyone who refused that they will be immediately put down as a suspect. I cannot have the local people think we aren't handling this." It was all to do with how we appeared, not what we were actually doing. Sure, it mattered that the people of Torkton felt like we were confident and assured in the way we dealt with things, but the fact of the matter was, we weren't handling it at all. We were taking blind swings at an invisible assailant who had us all scared shitless. "Sheriff," I began. "Go find McAllister," he grumbled. I pondered, arguing for a second, and then decided that there was no way I was winning this fight. "All right." I'd tried contacting Jim earlier in the week to no avail, so I knew that my only real option was to head to his place. That is, if he hadn't packed all of his belongings together and jumped on the next plane to the East Coast. As Alverson sauntered back to his office, I hurriedly tidied the small mess of papers on my desk and headed out to the lot, opting to take my own car instead of one of the precinct's vehicles. I felt a weight upon my shoulder, as though the thick, humid air was pressing down on me. Jim's sudden absence was simply another rung on this ladder of stress. I was already thinking non-stop about what I had seen, and when I'd once again find myself staring at another grisly picture just like it. The rain clouds began to spit as I drove through the downtown area, their dark gray forms harbingers of an oncoming thunderstorm. Jim lived in an apartment complex about 4 miles away from the station, fairly close to the edge of town, and far enough away from the center for very few cares to be given about any renovations that it may have needed. I had only ever been there once to drop Jim off when his car was in for repairs, but it wasn't hard to find. The rain hammered down aggressively on the exterior of my car, the relentless metallic banging making me feel as though I was trapped inside a tin can at a shooting range. I pulled into the parking lot and grabbed an anorak that had slipped from the seat to the foothold in the back of the car, thinking of what exactly I should say to Jim. That was, of course, if he hadn't locked himself in his bathroom, and, well, you know. This wasn't an idea that I was particularly fond of entertaining. I exited my car and walked briskly to the door of the apartment, dialing his room number into the panel by the door and hitting call as the rain lapped hungrily at my shoes. "Jim, it's Mikhail. If you're up there, open up. I'm not here to drag you back to Alverson, just here to talk." Nothing came through the receiver. Looking across the lot, I saw Jim's car parked in the looming shadow of a pine tree. I tried calling again, but this time trying to sound noticeably irritated. "I know you're in there, man. It's been a shitty week for everyone who's on the case, but I've got to talk to you. Besides, it's coming down out here, and I'm cold as hell. Open the damn door." The receiver cracked suddenly, and a hoarse voice spilled from the speaker.
"Mikhail? Jesus, come on up."
I pulled the door open and wasted no time in bothering myself with the elevator. I dashed up the stairs to the second floor and marched down the corridor to his room. The door was open slightly, the deadbolt resting on the frame. I had barely even rapped on the door twice before Jim pulled it open, his eyes wide and a revolver in his right hand. "For Christ's sake!" I flinched and almost fell backward at the sight of the weapon's maw staring me in the face. Jim lowered it and spoke through deep breaths and an apparent lump in his throat.
"I had to make sure it was you, Mike."
"You heard me on the... whatever," I said, perplexed by Jim's evidently rampant paranoia, but unwilling to make him feel any more uncomfortable than he already was. "It's me, man. It's me. What the hell is this all about?" I asked, gesturing at the weapon.
"You better come in."
I followed Jim into his dimly lit apartment. I had expected it to be far messier than it actually was. There were no takeout boxes littering the floor or sloppily stacked up on top of one another, and no offensive smells emanated from the kitchen. Jim had clearly been drinking, however. On his coffee table sat a quarter-full bottle of cognac, next to a cheap-looking whiskey glass. How long you been working on that?" I said with a spiritless chuckle.
"Couple days, I guess. Strong stuff. You want any?"
His words sprayed like a tree in the breeze. "I'm good. Jim, I'm gonna be frank with you. I came here from the station. I saw a newspaper, and Alverson needs you to get in touch with the Jefferson Herald and tell them to pull that headline."
"Fuck Alverson."
Those words were not spoken by the liquid voice in his blood. They were assured, steady, and serious.
"Fuck Alverson, and fuck his callous bullshit. He's handled this about as well as a blind shrew in a knife fight. I wouldn't even dream of bringing what I found out to him because he'd have me in a jail before I even got the whole story out. And believe you me, Mike, I found some stuff out. Oh, I found some goddamn stuff out."
"What did you find out?" I asked, bewildered.
You're gonna think I'm just a drunk asshole who snapped at the sight of too many spilled internal organs. But you're my closest damn friend here. And I trust you're gonna listen to me.
"I'm listening," I said.
Firstly, yeah, I did give the Herald that information. And there's no way in hell I'm having them pull the story. No one is safe here. And they need to know what's going on so they can take as many precautions as they can. The killer had no connections to any of the victims. Anyone could be the next casualty.
Hold on, you think you know who the killer is? He gave me a sternly sincere look. My blood ran cold as disbelief flooded my veins. Jim was completely serious. Somewhere inside my head, logic and fantasy were locked in a fierce duel, and fantasy was winning. Jim, I said through nervous breaths, do you know who the killer is? If you do, how the hell did you find out?
I'm not a detective, Mike. Shit, I'm barely a police officer. But I think I might actually have some idea.
Go on. Jim poured himself another shallow glass of cognac.
I used to frequent a bar downtown. The Foxhole, you know it. There was a retired old park ranger who would always be there on Friday nights, and he had a catalog of stories from his time, and we'd all sit around and listen to him. One night, I want to say about 6 months ago, he told a story that he said was his last call before he retired. It happened last year. Went like this. A hiking party of about 6 people got stranded in the deep woods of Mount Pilchuck State Park. Wandered off the trail by accident, I guess. 2 of the 6 people came back. 2. A woman named Estelle Palmer and a man named Reuben Grundy. Grundy was in a hell of a state when the Rangers found him. Allegedly said that he had no idea where the other 4 people had gone, that they had wandered off into the night. Here's where it gets even weirder. Palmer said that the night before they had been found, there were still 3 of them. Another man, I think. Palmer had been in and out of sleep and swore that she saw Grundy follow the other guy into the woods when he was gonna piss or something. The man never came back, but Grundy did 10 minutes later. She said he looked different, thinner, taller, and insisted that he'd had blood all around his mouth. She'd felt this overwhelming fear and just pretended like she was asleep. Of course, her story was written off as delirious rambling.
Jim cleared his throat and took another swig.
Something about the story just gave me a genuine feeling of dread that none of this guy's other stories had quite done. Then the old bastard puts the cherry on top. A week later, the U.S. Forest Service finds remains in the woods with what were presumed to be human teeth marks on them. But they were so pulverized they can't place exactly who they were. Grundy and Palmer are both interviewed again, but nothing comes of it. Palmer even tells the same story and says that she knows what she saw, but they write it off again. I told the old man before closing time that night that he'd scared the hell out of me, but that I didn't believe him. And he just looked at me with this deadpan expression and said, "Look it up, son." So I did. And what do you know? It happened. Multiple different news sources covered the story. It fucking happened. Was barely covered on TV.
Right, I started. But Pilchuck State Park is huge. The surrounding area is...
Reuben Grundy lives in Torkton, Mike. He owns a ranch.
He fumbled around with a mess of documents on the coffee table.
Estelle Palmer used to live in Torkton too. Literally a quarter mile down the road from Grundy. She'd lived there her whole life by the looks of things.
Are those police records? I asked. Jim gave me an irritated side eye and continued.
Point is, after she came back from that expedition, she moved 4 towns away. Packed up and left in about a week. Sold the farmhouse she lived in to someone who'd been on her ass about buying it for years. Her childhood home, from what I read. Whether or not Reuben Grundy was responsible for those people disappearing, she saw something happen in those woods that made it so she couldn't even stand to be near him.
Logic struggled onwards in its ongoing battle inside my brain. It strained and strained, but superstition's blade was far too sharp. Maybe she was just a whack job, I said. You know what towny folk are like. Live in the same place all their lives and...
Clean bill of mental health,
Jim exclaimed, waving a crumpled medical record in my face, clearly taken from a local clinic.
No history of schizophrenia, depression, BPD, or even so much as a panic attack. No prescribed medications. It's entirely possible that we could put what she saw down to hunger, dehydration, or on the off chance maybe even the delayed effects of a hallucinogenic trip. But the matter of the fact is, this woman up and left in a matter of days after that incident. It's not like Torkton's right next door to Mount Pilchuck either.
Jim dropped the medical record on the floor and shakily pulled up another document. He was excited or terrified, or both.
So, look here. Her new address is in May Creek.
Jim, Jim, you're chasing a roller coaster of a story here.
If we take this to Alverson, he's just gonna give us a whole spiel about how we're idiots and then take it upon himself to rehire me just so he can fire me. We take it to Evans, and he's gonna think we're on a wild goose chase because he's a guy who deals with career criminals in Seattle and the odd home invasion. He's probably been with the force for what, 2, 3 years? Face it, Mike. Our higher-ups are stuck scratching their heads and we might actually have a lead. I know it sounds crazy. I know it's a long shot, and it's dumb luck that I heard that story. But we may have an actual suspect.
In the moment, Jim's obsessive joining of the dots had rendered me dumbfounded, unable to think straight. So you're saying...
The killer is Reuben Grundy.
Jim blurted out.
Maybe I'm just another drunk asshole who wishes he was a big shot detective, and maybe I'm completely wrong. But if even there's a chance that I'm right, we have to do something.
Jim had a point. Even in the midst of his fanatical behavior, Alverson didn't care, and Evans, despite leading the charge, was being eaten up by his own fear. I saw it screaming behind his eyes the night of Sally McMahon's murder. All right, what's the plan?
We visit Estelle Palmer in May Creek and we ask her about Grundy.
Jim said through shaking breaths.
What he was like, if he seemed different during or after the hiking trip, all that jazz. If we can convince her to help us beyond just talking to us, then maybe we actually have a chance at communicating it to Evans.
Either that, or she chases us out of her house with a double barrel for even asking, I said dryly.
Ever the pessimist.
I laughed. Get some fresh clothes on, sober up, and let's get our asses to May Creek. Jim and I arrived at Estelle Palmer's residence in May Creek an hour later, having backtracked along numerous roads due to the exhausted GPS in my car. We parked across from Palmer's house, number 5 Fairbank Street. The place was not at all what I had anticipated. I had expected to pull up next to an overgrown lawn brimming with tall weeds and a crudely arranged patio that led up to a dingy porch with a grimy screen door. Perhaps there would have been a sign hampered on the wall made of plywood and scrawled on it in red paint that would have the words, "Trespassers will be shot." It was nothing like that. If anything, it was not unlike any of the other idyllic-looking houses in May Creek. The lawn was a healthy burst of green, each blade of grass seemingly trimmed down to exactly the same size, and just by the curb lay a toy truck that must have belonged to a child. Jim swept his hair out of his eyes and opened the car door.
Well, here goes. We either get our answers here, or we get a door slammed in our faces.
We approached the front door, peering through the living room window and catching sight of a woman sitting in a reclining chair, watching a young boy of no more than 3 years of age playing on the floor. She looked up as Jim rang the doorbell and stood up next to the living room, motioning to the toddler to stay where he was. Estelle Palmer swung the door open, a sense of immediate irritation glinting in her eyes. She was about 38 years of age, with long, dirty blonde hair that fell to her shoulders. Noticing her annoyance, I began to speak. "Mrs. Palmer."
Miss, I'm not married.
Estelle said.
Right, Miss Palmer.
Jim took over.
My name's Jim McAllister, and this is Mikhail Lemansky. We don't mean to upset you, but we're...
Cops?
She snapped. Jim was visibly surprised.
I figured. Where you from? Sultan? Don't tell me you're from Seattle.
Torkton, I said. Her glare narrowed even further.
It's our understanding that you used to live there.
Yes? What's it to you?
She seemed even more defensive now.
We came to inquire about...
Jim struggled over unnecessary eloquence, even though he fully expected to receive the cold shoulder. Miss Palmer's irritation reached its peak, and she began to shut the door.
It's about Reuben Grundy.
Jim finally managed. She stopped and peered through the crack between the frame and the door. Her annoyance had dissipated, and worry flooded her eyes.
You can come in.
She finally said, ushering us inside. The interior of the house was as picturesque as the exterior. The staircase adorned with paintings of famous North American mountains. The kitchen clean and well organized. Estelle led us into the living room, where the boy, who I presumed to be her son, looked up at us with that wide-eyed, curious expression that is so common in young children.
Baby, go play in your room, okay?
Estelle said to the boy. He looked down at the plastic dinosaur he was playing with, then back at his mother, before picking up the toy and sauntering down to the end of the hallway. Before Jim and I could get a word out about how sweet her child was, her worrisome expression returned.
I haven't seen Ruben in over a year. When I moved here, he used to call my cell 5 times a week before I changed numbers. Didn't tell him I was moving here. Of course I didn't. What the hell's he done?
It's not what he's done, I said. It's what we think he might have done.
Miss Palmer.
Please, it's just Estelle.
She said softly, seemingly far less vexed by our presence than she had been minutes before.
Estelle, the situation is this. My friend and I have reason to believe that Reuben Grundy may be linked to a series of violent serial killings in Torkton. However, it's little more than a hunch, and the police investigation has been a complete mess from the outset. So we need your help. It's my understanding that you knew Reuben for most of your life.
Estelle sat down in the reclining chair, motioning for us to sit down on the couch.
My whole life. Yeah. His old man, Scott, owned this ranch down the road from my old house, and he inherited the whole place when Scott passed. We were in the same grade at school. He was always a smart, worldly guy. Knew a whole lot about nature and cared a lot for the animals he reared on the ranch. Could name every damn plant in the woods.
She chuckled as she reminisced. Throughout your childhood, did he ever seem off to you at any point?
No. Never. Not once did I have him pinned as the outcast or the weirdo kid. Everyone in high school loved Reuben.
I have to ask about the hiking trip. 4 people disappeared, and you and Reuben were the only ones who came back. You moved away a week after. What the hell happened?
Estelle's voice quaked as she spoke, fear mingling with the worry in her eyes.
Reuben.
She trailed off, straining against the painful memories to force the words out.
Reuben changed on that trip. We were a week into it, and there was clearly something strange going on with him. Usually he'd be musing about conifer trees and mountain lions, but he barely spoke. And when he did, the way he talked was fragmented and hoarse, like he'd forgotten his own native language. He seemed irritated when we tried to talk to him. He didn't talk about much, but when he did, he said...
Her words crumpled to the floor again. I leaned forward. What did he say, Estelle?
He said he was hungry.
An electric current surged down my spine. The silence rang in my ears like the whining aftermath of an explosion.
I'd hear him at night. He'd sit out by the fire longer than anyone and mutter to himself, saying things like, "God, I'm so fucking hungry," in this voice that I'd never heard come out of him before. When it became obvious that we were lost, that's when people started disappearing. First Becca, then Miguel, then Ruth, and then Nick. The night before we were found. When Nick disappeared, I saw Reuben follow him into the forest. I didn't hear anything, but Reuben came back later without him. He looked different. Sickly, pale, skinny, taller somehow. And I swear to God, he was covered in blood.
I looked over at Jim, who was staring intently at her.
Maybe I was delirious. Maybe I was. He looked the same as ever the next day, when the park rangers found us. I just couldn't shake this feeling that I was still in danger, though. He talked in that cracked, hoarse way still. The police paid it no mind, wrote it off as the effects of dehydration, and wrote my story off as a mirage. I moved as soon as I could when I got home. Stayed with my mom in Olympia for a short while before I found a place here in May Creek. Like I said, maybe I was crazy. I'm not saying Reuben Grundy definitely killed those people. but I am certain that something in those woods got inside of him and made itself a home. And I don't think it ever left.
Jim's intense concentration turned to slight confusion.
What do you mean, something?
Estelle gave a half smile, as though she was embarrassed.
I'm not one to believe in folk tales, Mr. McAllister. Never have been, even when my old man tried to scare me to death with them when I wasn't much older than my son. But Reuben was always the same up until that trip, and he changed so suddenly. Call it what you want. A spirit, a sickness, the call of nature, whatever. Something took a hold of Reuben, took him away. I'm not saying that if you investigate him, you'll definitely find the answers you're looking for, but you might want to try.
Noticing that Estelle was on the verge of tears, I grabbed Jim's arm and said, "Thank you so much for your help. We should probably get going and leave you in peace."
Estelle,
Jim said tentatively.
I don't suppose we could convince you to come with us.
No,
She interjected.
I can't see Reuben ever again, not after what I saw in those woods. He doesn't know where I live, but I still lock every door and window at night. Still watch the footage from the security camera every morning. Sometimes I think if I met him again, it would lay some ghosts to rest, but something tells me those ghosts are real damned stubborn. I can't put myself in danger. I'm the only thing that Robert has.
She motioned down the hall towards her son's bedroom. Jim looked as though he were about to persist in his argument, but he simmered down quickly.
Thank you for your time, Estelle. Sincerely.
Jim said as he stood up and walked to the door.
We're gonna go give Reuben a visit. We will find out who's doing this. I promise.
Thank you. Good luck.
She silently walked us down the driveway to the car, a solemn look in her eyes. Perhaps she was reliving all those memories, or perhaps she thought she had just sent us further into something we would regret being a part of. I looked over at the house one last time as I started the car. Through the living room window, I can make out a blurred picture of Estelle cradling her son in a tender embrace. We drove. I pulled the car up to Torkton Police Station at 6:15 p.m., having convinced a particularly irate Jim to stop off there first. I told him to wait in the car while I briefly went to talk to Alverson. Apparently, he'd at the very least done a good job of rounding up the local populace for questioning, as I had to sift through a chattering crowd of townsfolk who were gathered outside and inside the station. I ran to Alverson's office, rapping sharply on the door. "Who the hell is that?" came a gritty, aggravated reply. I opened the door, and my gaze met Sheriff Alverson's cockeyed stare. "Where the hell have you been, Lemansky?" "Have you interviewed a man named Reuben Grundy?" I asked, ignoring him. "Who?" Alverson said. "Reuben Grundy, rancher from north end of Torkton." "The fuck should I know?" Alverson said, taking an aggressive swig of his coffee. "Officer Burnett has a checklist. Go ask her. Now, where in God's name have you been? You get McAllister to pull that article?" I slammed his door and ran to the front desk, where I found Officer Burnett busying herself with an Excel spreadsheet. I nearly collided with the desk, startling her. "Eve," I said, letting out a long breath, "have you interviewed a man named Reuben Grundy yet?" Visibly confused by my urgency, she pulled up the records and perused them for about 10 seconds.
Looks like we had him in a couple hours ago. We cleared him. He's not down as a suspect.
"Christ, where's Detective Evans?"
Monroe.
She said absent-mindedly.
Something came up from another case and he left a few hours.
"How long did you have Grundy in the interview room for?" My words were ablaze with insistence.
5 minutes. In and out.
Barnett replied. "You've got to be kidding me. They didn't even ask him about the hiking trip." "Thanks." I dashed out of the station, feeling the mystified eyes of the townspeople boring into me. Jim was waiting in anticipation, craning his neck around as I ran toward the car. I threw the door open and clambered inside. "They cleared the bastard 2 hours ago. Evans is in Monroe, and we're heading to Grundy's place."
Let's go.
His tone was crawling with nerves. He had clearly expected it to come to this, but now the reality of it was sinking in. Fear brewed underneath my adrenaline rush. The sun began to exhaustedly sink below the distant mountains as we sped through Torkton, painting a crimson outline on the remaining clouds. The stench of dread began to creep in through the cracked passenger side window with every inch that the sun receded. I began to wish it would take longer to get to Grundy's ranch, anything to stave off the terrible gut feeling.
So Evans went to Monroe? What for?
Jim asked, obviously desperate to break the silence. Barnett said it was another case. Whether or not that's a lie, I don't know, and I don't care. He's shit scared, and he's not here, which makes him useless. I replied.
What about Alverson?
He wasn't even doing so much as ushering the interview. Viewees in, just asked me about whether or not the Herald had been convinced to pull the front page. We're on our own, Jim. As I said that, the row of buildings on North Avenue disappeared, and Grundy's Ranch came into view.
In late 2008, I went on a youth retreat when I was in early secondary school. The setting was a privately run camp used by several religious and community groups throughout the year. What made the whole experience notable was the consistency of what multiple people reported, all under similar conditions. So one evening after scheduled activities had ended, 4 of us were moving between cabins during a game that involved navigating the grounds after dark. The camp allowed limited free movement at night, and several large refuse containers had been placed near service roads at the edge of the property due to renovations. While walking to the designated start point, we noticed what appeared to be the top portion of a head visible above one of the metal bins. It was stationary and partially obscured, and our initial assumption was that it was another camper attempting to hide or maybe scare us or something. Without discussing it too much, we spread out to approach from both sides. The plan was informal and a bit uncoordinated, but as one person gave a signal to move in, we sort of rounded the corners of the container. And when we did, no one was there. We even checked inside of the bin using a torch, but it was empty and undisturbed. As we were regrouping, one of us pointed toward a sloped section of the ground leading down toward another cluster of cabins, and there was a figure moving away at a speed that just seemed, well, not possible. It was upright, roughly adult-sized, and moved on 2 legs. That much was clear. But due to the distance and the lighting and the angle, we couldn't see any facial features or clothing details that were clear anyway. We followed at a distance, not running directly toward it, but attempting to keep it in view. And as we approached the tree line near the second campsite, movement suddenly occurred closer to us. A face briefly appeared from behind a narrow tree trunk, maybe 6 or 7 feet ahead of us. The color appeared completely dark, maybe due to shadows, but the features were indistinct but sort of human-like, I would say. At that point, though, our group stopped advancing. Again, there was no verbal coordination, but one of the older and larger boys moved in front of the rest of us, and the object that he pulled from his pocket was later identified as a small utility knife that apparently he carried around with him everywhere, not something brought intentionally. The face was visible for, I would say, less than a second before it just disappeared. The tree that it appeared from was too thin to fully conceal a person too, which was just so strange, and certainly contributed to the sense of something being very off. Moments later, a similar shape appeared from a different position, further to the right this time. The movement between the positions was not observed directly, but only inferred due to timing, so I can only assume that it was the same person or thing or whatever. At that stage, though, we disengaged and we decided to go back toward the main hall. Once inside, the physical response was immediate. I was shaking, I had difficulty speaking, and I just felt terrified and just really awful. This lasted several minutes. Others reported elevated heart rates and feeling a bit lightheaded, but I think it was just the anxiety from the whole thing, I suppose. We reported the incident to an older camper assigned to supervise our group, and he separated us and asked each of us to describe what happened independently, and our accounts matched on key points. Location, sequence, distance, timing, what we saw. There were some minor differences, obviously, but the core details aligned perfectly. Skeptical, he walked part of the route with us to verify the locations, and during this walk, even he observed movement near the same tree line and reacted strongly, insisting that we all return immediately. No further investigation was conducted that night, and that person was shaken for sure. In the following days, the staff kept a close eye out for whatever this thing was, some of them speculating that it could have been a deer or something else, but I can tell you that that was no deer. Eventually, we all parted ways and I went home, and really, that was the end of it. I was in my first few years working patrol in a regional location when this happened. By that stage of my career, I had already handled serious calls, fatal crashes, suicides, and next of kin notifications were pretty common. But this one always stood out due to just how it unfolded, not because of anything overtly dramatic. So, I was dispatched just after midnight to conduct a death notification following a single vehicle collision on a rural highway. The deceased was a middle-aged woman, pronounced dead at the scene, and her registered address was a semi-rural property about 10 miles from the crash site. The property was set back from the road behind a wire gate, and when I arrived, my headlights illuminated a figure standing just inside of the entrance. The woman appeared calm and unhurried. She was dressed casually and didn't seem surprised to see a marked vehicle pull up at that hour. Before I spoke, though, she commented that she had heard a car approaching long before I reached the gate. Given the stillness of the area at night, that didn't strike me as too unusual. I asked if she lived on the property, and she answered yes. I then asked if we could talk closer to the house, and she agreed and mentioned that the walk would be helpful since the residence was some distance from the road anyway. We walked separately toward the house, which sat back on the property. I slowed at one point to watch my footing, and when I looked up again, I swear to you that she was just gone. She was no longer beside me, and I assumed at first that she must have gone ahead. At the front of the house, I stepped onto a small porch and I waited. The property was unlit, and aside from the sound of insects, it was pretty quiet. After a short pause, the front door opened and a younger woman appeared, clearly alarmed by my presence. I identified myself and explained that I needed to speak with the occupants. She invited me inside and called for her partner. When I asked about the woman that I had met at the gate, she appeared confused and said that nobody else was home. At that point, I excused myself briefly and conducted a quick check of the yard and the surrounding area. There were no vehicles, no movement, and no signs that anyone had entered or left on foot. I returned inside and I proceeded with the notification. The deceased was identified as the younger woman's mother, and according to the family, she had moved into the home several months earlier after the death of her husband and had been struggling emotionally. The family reaction was pretty consistent with unexpected loss, obviously, shock, disbelief, and distress, but while they spoke quietly among themselves, I noticed a framed photograph on the shelf, and it showed a woman several years younger than the one listed in the report, but the resemblance to the person that I had encountered at the gate was perfect, pretty much. In fact, it was so strong that I asked about it. The daughter confirmed that it was her mother, taken not long before she had moved in. At the time, I didn't comment further. I completed the necessary paperwork, provided support information, and left once another unit arrived to assist. But in the days that followed, I reviewed that sequence repeatedly. There were no reports of neighbors confirming anyone else present. The gate showed no signs of recent activity beyond my own. There was no security footage available, unfortunately, which I would have loved to have seen. But I know that I met someone there, and I saw that person in the picture frame. I'm certain of it. This event changed me for the good too, and I'm no longer so closed to the possibility of life beyond death anymore. It's something that I think about often, and I just cannot shake. My partner and I took a short trip to the western coast of Portugal, near a small town south of Nazaré. We rented a minimalist roadside cabin that had been converted from a former utility structure. The unit was positioned above a drop-off that led down to a rocky drainage channel feeding into the Atlantic. One side of the structure consisted almost entirely of reinforced glass facing the slope. Now, the accommodation was pretty isolated. There were no neighboring buildings within immediate view, and the access road was pretty narrow and unlit at night. During the day, the location appeared unremarkable too, and after sunset, the absence of ambient noise was pretty noticeable. No traffic, limited wind, and minimal wildlife activity too. Now, sometime shortly after 1:30 in the morning, both of us woke up abruptly. The cause was a series of distinct impacts against the glass wall beside the bed. There were 3 or 4 sounds, evenly spaced, with enough force to register as deliberate contact rather than an incidental noise. The spacing between the sounds suggested intent or rhythm rather than random movement as well. The bed had been placed directly adjacent to the glass wall at this stage, and a heavy interior blind was lowered, blocking visibility. Neither of us spoke immediately, and the sound was unmistakable as to where it was coming from. My first assumption was a person outside of the structure. That assumption was quickly complicated by the layout, though. You see, the exterior side of the glass faced a sharply sloped embankment, and there was no platform, walkway, or level surface at that elevation. In daylight, it would have been difficult to maintain footing there, let alone stand upright and apply force at shoulder height. I stood up and secured the door, despite knowing that it offered limited reassurance. When I moved toward the blind to lift it, my partner stopped me. We waited several minutes without any additional sound, and eventually I raised the blind slightly. The flashlight on my phone illuminated the immediate area, but there was no movement. The slope below the windows was uneven, like I said, covered in loose rock and scrub vegetation. No footprints or disturbed ground were visible in the beam. The angle in the distance made it implausible for someone to have reached the window without sliding at the very least, and, well, we remained awake for the rest of the night after that. No further noises occurred. The following morning, we inspected the exterior in daylight as well. The ground below the window showed signs of erosion and loose debris. A thick, partially detached tree branch from higher up the slope was visible. It appeared sort of capable of swinging down slope if it was dislodged. The height of its arc aligned roughly with the impact points in the glass, I suppose. And quite honestly, I was pretty satisfied with that explanation for at least a little bit, until we found some clear footprints right where the impact sound was. Now, I have no idea what someone would be doing there that late at night, banging on glass like that. It's very strange, obviously, but I was more worried about whoever they were coming back the next night, so we ended up sort of cutting our time there a little shorter than we expected, and moved on. Thankfully, nothing else happened in the next spot, but I'll never forget that night and the eerie feeling I get when I remember my partner stopping me from going to the blind. If I had opened it earlier, would something have happened to us that night? I don't like to think about that, and so I tend to not dwell on it. Earlier today, I met a colleague for a midday meal near Rotterdam Central Station. After eating, we walked together into the station concourse. This location is a multi-level interchange with separated access points, controlled by entry barriers and clear divisions between stairwells and escalators. We each needed to access different platforms on different levels at that stage, and at the junction where the routes split, we stopped briefly to finish our conversation. From that point, the stairwell to my platform was to the left and fully enclosed by solid walls. The escalator that my colleague needed was to the right and bordered by glass panels. From where we stood, it wasn't possible to move between these two paths without returning to the junction. We parted without ceremony, and I turned immediately into the stairwell. I didn't look back. The stairwell has no windows, mirrors, or reflective surfaces. It takes about 40 seconds to descend and exit onto the platform. And while walking down, I opened my bag to retrieve my earphones and began playing music as I stepped onto the platform. Less than a minute after arriving, I received a message from my colleague. She asked whether I had changed direction and followed her toward the escalator instead of taking the stairs. I responded that I had not and asked why she thought that. She then described what she had seen. According to her, as she was ascending the escalator, she noticed someone walking toward her from the opposite direction. This person matched my appearance precisely, apparently. Same hairstyle, same jacket, same backpack, same posture even. She specifically mentioned the way that the person held the bag and reached into it, which she recognized as something that I do habitually. She was confident enough that she assumed that I had decided to rejoin her or had realized that I was heading the wrong way or something. But what made her pause was that the person did not make eye contact or even acknowledge her. She said that she only saw the upper half of the body because the lower portion was obscured by the glass barrier along the escalator, and by the time that she reached the top and turned around, the person was no longer visible. At no point did I leave the stairwell or re-enter the concourse, though, or move toward the escalator even. The timestamps on our messages confirm this as well, and based on the station layout and the pedestrian flow, it just would not have been physically possible for me to reach the escalator ahead of her without passing her directly. We later reviewed the station maps and sightlines together. There are no mirrors, advertising screens, or reflective surfaces positioned in a way that could produce a delayed or distorted image of someone walking in another area like this. There are also no parallel walkways adjacent to the escalator that connect to the stairwell I used. One possibility, obviously, is mistaken identity. However, she maintains that the clothing, the bag, and the movement patterns were way too specific to dismiss. During lunch, we had discussed abstract topics too, including mortality and anecdotal accounts of unexplained experiences, things like this. And I acknowledge that this context could have primed her to interpret ambiguous sensory information more personally, but that said, she contacted me immediately and expressed a lot of confusion rather than fear, which does suggest that she was not seeking meaning or drama in what she observed. Nothing unusual occurred after this incident. I arrived home safely, my colleague reported no further issues for the rest of the day, and there was no follow-up sightings, technical anomalies, or corroborating reports from others in the station. At this point, the most plausible explanation remains a brief perceptual error involving an unknown individual who just happened to resemble me closely. But my friend, she just swears that it wasn't that. I entered law enforcement in 2016 and was assigned to patrol duties in Western Pennsylvania, working primarily evening shifts during my first year. The one routine task assigned to the late shift was securing municipal properties that remained open to the public during daylight hours. One of these locations was an old city cemetery located near a former industrial corridor. It bordered abandoned warehouses, low-income housing, and a rail spur that was no longer active. Calls for service in that area were pretty frequent, but usually unrelated to the cemetery itself. Now, the cemetery dated back to the late 1800s and covered several acres at this stage. It had 3 vehicle access gates spaced along the perimeter road. Standard procedure required locking all 3 shortly after dusk. Officers generally handled this alone, unless there was an active call nearby, obviously. The task was considered low risk, but required situational awareness due to past incidents involving vandalism, loitering, and people using the grounds as a shortcut after hours. Now, on the night in question, I arrived just after 9:30 p.m. Conditions were pretty typical for the season: dry weather, limited pedestrian traffic, and low ambient lighting too. Before exiting my vehicle, I followed protocol by activating the alley light and sweeping the immediate area with the mounted spotlight that I had. I didn't observe any movement near the gate or between the headstones closest to the entrance. I exited the vehicle and began unlocking the chain securing the first gate. The locking mechanism was pretty old and often required multiple attempts to get it. And while focusing on the keypad, I became aware of something in my direct line of sight that did not register as movement, but more as a presence, I guess. I looked up and saw a female figure, standing maybe 30 feet inside the grounds, near a row of older headstones. The individual was stationary, facing in my direction. Her posture was upright, but not rigid. I noted several details immediately because they didn't align with common encounters in that area too. She was not dressed in modern clothing by any means. In fact, the outfit resembled an older style dress or coat, dark in color with no visible reflective material. Her facial expression appeared neutral, I would say. I didn't observe blinking either, which was a bit weird. No shifting weight or other indicators of alertness or intoxication or anything. I identified myself verbally and issued a standard instruction that she needed to leave the area, assuming at first that she might be disoriented or trespassing. But there was no response. I repeated the command more firmly this time. Again, no verbal or physical reaction. At this point, my attention shifted to assessing distance and options rather than interpreting what I was seeing. I returned my focus briefly to the gate to remove the chain fully, intending to re-secure it and then approach with backup. The process took less than maybe 10 seconds, and when I looked back toward the same location, she was no longer there. I immediately scanned the surrounding area with my handheld flashlight and vehicle spotlight even. There were no clear paths or cover nearby that would have allowed someone to leave the area without being seen or at least heard. I mean, the ground was uneven and movement should have been audible. did not locate anyone matching the description, though. I requested another unit at this point to check the interior of the cemetery while I completed locking the remaining gates. A fellow officer from a neighboring zone responded. I didn't describe what I had seen in detail, only that I thought that someone might have been in the grounds. We conducted a brief search and we found no one. At the time, I attributed the whole thing to somebody being just pretty quick and getting away, and so I didn't really document it formally and didn't discuss it with the supervisors or anything either. Several years later, though, during an informal conversation with colleagues, the topic of unusual calls came up, and I mentioned the cemetery incident in passing, minimizing the details a lot. And to my surprise, 2 other officers independently described encountering a woman in the same general area of the cemetery during late hours. Their descriptions varied slightly, but overlapped in key aspects for sure. Stationary posture, outdated clothing, a lack of response to verbal commands, and sudden absence. None of these incidents resulted in reports to complaints or follow-up investigation. No officer reported physical interaction, threats, or continued sightings beyond a single occurrence. And look, I'm not offering a conclusion here by any means. There's obviously a few ways to interpret these events, but there's also the possibility that something weird was going on here. I have not returned to the cemetery in years as well. The location was eventually reassigned to automatic gate systems, eliminating the need for manual closures from us. And so, no further incidences were ever reported to my knowledge. I'm sharing this now, though, because time has sort of removed the pressure to rationalize it immediately, and because acknowledging uncertainty doesn't require assigning supernatural meaning either. It only requires accuracy about what was observed and what was not. And I can assure you that that woman was there and then she was just gone. A few years back, I accompanied a friend, Evan, and his parents on a camping trip in central Idaho somewhere, outside of a small town near the Sawtooth foothills, I think. The location was pretty remote, accessed by a long dirt road with no nearby services or cell coverage. Evan's parents had recently purchased a camper trailer and wanted to test it out on a multi-night trip, so I joined them for one night. The day itself was pretty good, actually. We arrived in the afternoon, set up camp, cooked some food, and drank a moderate amount. There were no drugs involved beyond alcohol and a bit of tobacco, and that was it. And so, by around 10:30, Evan's parents went into the trailer to get some sleep. But Evan and I stayed outside by the fire to talk a little bit more before turning in. At this point, nothing felt unusual as well. The weather conditions were good, there was no wind, and it was clear visibility. Wildlife noise was pretty minimal, and the fire was the only significant light source at this point. We were seated facing the open clearing in front of the campsite, with trees behind and to the sides of us. Our conversation sort of drifted a bit. We were talking about space, intelligence beyond Earth, and stuff like that, and how people tend to avoid thinking about stuff like this, but this was a bit of a casual conversation that simply didn't change topics for an extended period, really. And during this time, I repeatedly looked toward and commented on the sky. There was nothing specific that I was reacting to, but just sort of the visibility of stars due to the lack of light pollution out there. And at around 11:15, while I was sort of mid-sentence and looking forward, not upward, something occurred directly in front of us. A sequence of lights appeared suddenly at low altitude, no more than a few feet above ground level as well, within roughly about maybe 10 feet of the fire. The lights were not suspended, they moved downward rapidly as a group, and just sort of stopped abruptly. At the same moment, there was a sound. It was brief, intense, and sort of mechanical rather than organic. It didn't resemble an animal or a firearm or a falling object or anything like that. The sound was localized though and didn't echo as a gunshot or thunder would. The lights and the sound occurred together and they lasted for about 2 seconds. But both Evan and I, we reacted immediately. I shouted some sort of a curse word. Evan reached for a flashlight that he kept in his jacket. Before he activated it, both of us stood and began moving backward toward the trailer. There was no discussion or hesitation, mind you. The response was just sort of automatic. And as we moved, I looked back towards the fire and the area beyond it, and what I could see was a tall, upright shape moving toward us from the same direction the lights had appeared. I cannot describe the features, the clothing, or the limbs or anything. I can only say that it was taller than either of us, light or anything, which was weird. I'm also aware that fear can distort perception, but the impression was consistent enough that it remains fixed in my memory. And well, as you can probably imagine, we just ran. In doing so, we knocked over chairs and equipment. We were yelling loud enough to wake Evan's parents now. Evan reached the door first, but struggled with the latch due to shaking, and his girlfriend, who was inside, opened it. I entered immediately, but Evan stayed outside momentarily to pull his dog inside. The dog had been out with us by the fire and was sort of resisting, growling and facing toward the clearing now. Once inside, I locked the door and I went to go and get the gun that I had in my bag. I didn't fire it and never pointed it outside or anything, but I was holding it while seated facing the door for quite some time. Evan's parents came out of the sleeping area, asking what had happened. Neither Evan nor I could provide a coherent explanation, though, beyond just saying that something had approached the campsite. The dog, it continued growling for several minutes after we were all inside. No further sounds came from outside, no footsteps, voices, or movement that we could detect. We didn't leave the trailer again that night, though, and there was no way in heck that I was about to go back out there. I was honestly shaking, I had a rapid heartbeat, and I sort of had delayed coordination, which was a bit weird, and it persisted for over an hour. I didn't sleep that night either. I just sat there, trying to come up with an explanation for what the heck I had just seen. In the morning, first thing as well, we inspected the campsite. There were no marks, impact points, or disturbed ground where the lights had appeared. None of the equipment was missing or damaged beyond what we had knocked over ourselves. But the weirdest thing is that there were no tracks that could be attributed to either us or the dog. Like, we went looking for tracks and we couldn't even see our own for some reason. We left shortly after breakfast that day, and I've not returned to the area since then, and have avoided discussing the incident publicly for some time now. Not because I'm too worried about what other people think, but also because, genuinely, I just have no idea what to make of any of it. When I was 15, I lived in a mid-sized industrial town. I occasionally worked part-time with a relative at a small retail operation that was attached to a warehouse complex. Several neighboring businesses shared the same loading area here, and employees from different units used the same outdoor space during breaks. Now, I used those breaks to step outside and smoke. Yes, I know, 15 and smoking, not great, but that is where I regularly crossed paths with a man that I called Marco. He was maybe in his mid-40s, and he worked for a nearby supplier. Our interactions were pretty brief and mostly superficial. Comments about customers, schedules, weather, minor workplace complaints, things like this. There was no flirting, no personal disclosures beyond casual remarks, and at the time I interpreted the familiarity as normal adult behavior toward a younger coworker. At some point, though, Marco mentioned that he had recently rented a house not far from where my family lived. He knew the area because my relative had done business with his employer at some point. He said that he was hosting a casual gathering to celebrate moving in, and claimed that several people from both workplaces were invited. He gave a specific afternoon time, and I didn't evaluate the situation critically by any means. I was isolated socially at that age and eager for anything that resembled inclusion. I informed my parents where I was going, using the explanation that he had given me, and left in the early afternoon. When I arrived, the first warning sign was immediate. He let me inside and locked the door behind me, placing the key in a place that made it pretty much inaccessible. I noticed that there were no coats, bags, music, or signs of any other people. When I asked where everyone was, he gave really inconsistent explanations, changing the timeline within the same conversation even. He was already intoxicated too. His speech was unsteady, and his behavior lacked normal boundaries for sure. After a short period of forced conversation, he insisted on showing me the house, and the tour ended in a bedroom where he made comments implying that I would be staying there long term. I sort of laughed reflexively, treating it as a bit of a joke, while internally recognizing that I had lost control of the situation completely. Back in the living area, he initiated physical contact without consent. He was much larger than me too, impaired and persistent. I resisted physically and verbally, and when I struck him hard enough to knock him off balance, he appeared confused rather than angry. He interpreted my prior politeness as encouragement, and stated this directly as well, listing basic social behaviors, smiling, conversation, eye contact as justification. His behavior escalated verbally. He began comparing me to his former spouse in this really obsessive sort of detail, including physical features, age, and even background. He spoke as if a future had already been decided. At that moment, I assessed that remaining passive would not ensure my safety. When he left the room to use the bathroom at one stage, I contacted a trusted co-worker who had supervisory responsibility for me at the time. He was out of town and initially resistant to believing the situation. He advised contacting the police, and I didn't do it, primarily out of fear of retaliation and family consequences too. But from that point forward, I focused on delay tactics. I avoided confrontation, redirected conversation, and presented compliance without commitment. Several hours passed this way as well, and by evening his intoxication increased and his attention waned. I told him that I needed medication and clothing from home and promised to return quickly. He then allowed me to leave, but threatened to interfere with my family's employment if I didn't come back. Once outside, though, there was no way that I was going to return. I began walking home in a really distressed state, attempting to determine how to protect my family without exposing myself to any further risk. During this time, I encountered a local man who was riding a bike, someone known in the area but not personally connected to me. He initiated a brief interaction and also noticed my condition. I explained the situation in minimal terms. He listened without interruption and asked me to point out the house from a distance. After doing so, he instructed me to go home and to disengage entirely. He didn't provide details of what he intended to do, but the following morning, he contacted me once to confirm that I was safe. He offered no explanation beyond reassurance, and within days, it became known through workplace conversations that Marco had vacated the house abruptly. The explanation circulating was that his residence had been forcibly entered overnight and severely damaged, and that he had even sustained some injuries. No formal details were shared, and I didn't ask for them either. I know that I got lucky that day and that things could have been just so much worse, but I'm thankful that I got out of there when I did, and also that I never saw Marco again. This took place in April of 2018. So I've lived most of my life in western Pennsylvania, but I followed an out-of-market baseball team and went out alone to watch an afternoon game while that team was playing locally. I chose a bar in Demont, one that I had passed many times but never entered. It was listed online as a sports bar, and nothing about the exterior suggested anything unusual. I arrived shortly before first pitch. Inside, the space was small and dim, but not run down. There was one woman behind the bar and an older couple seated several stools away. No one acknowledged me when I entered, and all three looked at me briefly, then resumed a low conversation among themselves. I assumed the lack of reaction was because I was wearing the opposing team's jersey or something. In any case, I took a seat near the largest television. After a few minutes, I noticed that there were no menus on the bar, no condiments, and no visible alcohol either. Behind the bar, there were no taps, bottles, or coolers, only shelves of miscellaneous local sports items that didn't appear curated or valuable or anything. Several signs were posted with generic, no-nonsense messages about behavior and defense, but none listed food or drink options. When I approached the bar to order, the bartender paused as if deciding how to proceed. Then she said that she would get me a menu. She disappeared into a back room for an extended period of time, long enough in fact that I even considered leaving. When she returned, the menu was limited and handwritten. Prices were extremely low as well. I ordered a basic combination of food, expecting either small portions or low quality, but the food arrived quickly. The portions were disproportionately huge, and the quality was unusually high given the price. I watched the bartender bring it out herself. When the back door opened briefly, I could see that the room behind it didn't resemble an active kitchen. There were no appliances, no staff movement, and no visible preparation or anything. Shortly after my food arrived, several additional patrons entered too. None sat near me. Every new arrival went to the far end of the bar and joined the original group. No one ordered anything. They spoke quietly, rarely moved, and didn't display normal reactions to the game despite all eyes being directed toward the screens. No one wore team apparel or expressed interest in the outcome, and when points were scored, there was no change in behavior or anything either. One individual repeatedly stood up though, inserted cash into a video gambling machine near my table, lost immediately, and returned to the group. This cycle continued for over an hour as well, without frustration or comment. Near the end of the game, he used the music system to play obscure recordings that didn't align with the venue or the crowd or anything. The music overrode the television audio, effectively ending my ability to follow the broadcast any longer. By this point, I had finished eating and also noticed that no one had checked in on me or anything. When I requested my bill, the bartender hesitated and consulted the group at the end of the bar, and after a brief exchange, the entire group stood and exited together through a rear door, and only then did she return with my check. I paid and I left immediately. Outside, one of the former patrons attempted to engage me in conversation, and I responded minimally and left the area pretty quickly because it was weird. And look, I know that this is going to sound a little bit crazy and a little bit weird, I get that, but have you ever just got the feeling that the people that you're speaking to are just not human? That's sort of how this went, and again, I know that that sounds so strange, but their behavior and the way that they spoke and everything was just so alien. I really don't know what to think about this. I don't know whether it was a private club that I just sort of stepped into uninvited, or if it was an informal social group or something. Maybe it was just a misrepresented establishment. I really don't know what it was. But here's the weirdest thing. So, not long after this, I would say maybe a week or two, or maybe even a month later or something, I went by that place and it was completely closed down, boarded up and everything. I have been thinking about it a lot lately, and it's weird, right? At the time that this happened, I was a graduate student living with 2 roommates. I was the only one with a car at the time, a 2019 Hyundai Elantra, which I had purchased earlier that year after my previous vehicle was completely totaled. This was before widespread public awareness of how frequently that model was being targeted for theft. Although break-ins in the city, they were already pretty common. And one evening, one of my roommates and her co-worker asked me to drive them to a recently opened restaurant in a redeveloped district near downtown. The area was advertised as busy and walkable, but parking infrastructure had not kept pace with the foot traffic. When we arrived, all nearby garages were pretty full. Rather than circle indefinitely or pay for a private lot farther away, I chose to park several blocks out into a residential street. The neighborhood transaction was pretty abrupt, but one block contained renovated apartments and bars, and 2 blocks later, the street lighting thinned and the building showed clear signs of neglect. I parked in front of a row of older duplexes. There were no other cars nearby, but nothing overtly indicated danger or anything. I locked the vehicle and we walked toward the restaurant, assuming that we would return within about an hour. That assumption was wrong. The restaurant was far more popular than expected. In fact, we waited nearly 3 hours to eat, and by the time that we left, the surrounding streets were mostly empty and it was fully dark. The energy that had made the area feel safe earlier was now completely gone. About halfway back, too, a man approached us from behind on the same sidewalk. He appeared disoriented and was speaking loudly, but his words were not coherent. We increased our space without responding, and he didn't run, but he continued following for nearly a full block before veering away. One of the women with me later admitted that she had not noticed him at all. The other and I were already alert when continuing walking. A few moments later, we noticed a guy on a bike, though. He was riding slowly with no lights, dressed in dark clothing and carrying a backpack. At first, this seemed almost incidental, I suppose. But then we realized that he was looping around us. He would sort of pass ahead, circle behind, then reappear at an angle that placed him between us and the next intersection. The pattern repeated several times, too. There was no verbal engagement, no obvious threat, and the behavior itself was the signal, I suppose. As we turned onto the street where my car was parked, the lighting worsened and the porch lights were sort of sporadic and street lamps were spaced far apart, and from a distance I could see my car, and what I could not immediately identify was the shape now standing beside it. As we got closer, I realized that somebody was crouched near the passenger side front wheel. I couldn't see his face, but his outline was clear enough to confirm that he was positioned deliberately and not passing through. I didn't unlock the car, and instead I pressed the lock button again, triggering the horn and the lights. The man stood up immediately and ran toward a nearby building, and as he did, another individual stepped forward from a recessed doorway, watching us but not approaching. At the same time, the guy riding the bike abandoned his circling and rode off in the opposite direction. We ran to the car and we got inside, and we left without hesitation. Thankfully, there was no pursuit, no attempts to block us, and the entire interaction ended in seconds once attention was drawn to it. Now, there was no definitive proof of coordination, but the timing and the positioning of all three of these guys, it didn't seem random. I inspected the car for damage, and I didn't find any. There were no tracking devices and signs of tampering that I could see, and still though, the situation forced a bit of a reassessment of just how quickly ordinary decisions can compound into true risk like this. I didn't report the incident, as technically nothing happened, but about a year later, when I relocated and attempted to update my insurance, I was denied coverage on that vehicle due to its theft profile. I sold it shortly afterward. These days, I try not to park in unfamiliar residential streets late at night. I don't usually question my own memory, but this is one of the few situations where I actively wish that I could dismiss what happened as a sequence of just unrelated errors, but I'm really questioning it. At the time, I was 19 and living in a regional town in New South Wales, not far from the railway line that cuts through the older part of town here. I lived in a weatherboard house with my parents and my younger son, who had just turned 3 at the time. The house had been in my family for decades at this point, and had even been altered several times, which meant odd layouts, mismatched doors, and locks that were functional but not modern. Now, I was home more than usual because I was between TAFE semesters and picking up extra evening shifts at a supermarket at the time. My mother was on leave at the time and watched my son while I was working. The night that this happened was pretty unremarkable, really. It was late July and cold enough that all doors were normally kept shut. I had been awake longer than usual because my son had refused to sleep until close to midnight, and by the time that he finally settled, I was tired enough that I stayed on the couch scrolling on my phone rather than moving him to his bed. The house was quiet, both my parents were asleep, the dogs were inside and lying near the heater in the hallway. Now, at about 11:15, I heard a sharp noise from the rear of the house. It was not a creak or a knock or anything. It sounded like a door being pulled closed with force. A few seconds later, I heard water running as well. I didn't move immediately. My first assumption was that my father had gotten up and turned on a tap or something. But the sound was just wrong for that. The kitchen sink is audible from the living room, but this was louder than that, sustained and clearly coming from the laundry area near the back door. I stood up and left my son on the couch and walked toward the kitchen. The back hallway light was off and the glass door that leads into the laundry was open. The exterior door beyond that was also open, letting the cold air in. The laundry tap was running at full pressure as well, which was weird. I turned it off and I closed both doors. The locks were disengaged, and I am certain of this because the external door requires a deliberate lift and sort of turn motion to lock it. I didn't do that earlier in the evening, but I also had no reason to open the door at any point. The dogs had been let inside before dark, and no one had gone out since, as far as I knew. I checked the rest of the ground floor, though. All windows were closed, the front door was locked, nothing appeared disturbed, and at this point I considered waking my parents, but I hesitated because I just couldn't identify a clear explanation that didn't involve me being mistaken. The house makes noises, after all. Animals moved through the yard, and I wanted a reason that allowed me to go back to the couch and sleep, I suppose. But that changed when I went upstairs. You see, there are only 2 windows upstairs that open fully, and when I checked the rear-facing one, I noticed movement near the shed at the back of the property. The motion sensor light came on briefly and then shut off again as well. This happens every so often due to possums here, so on its own it wouldn't have concerned me too much, but what did concern me was the timing. The light activated only after the laundry door incident and not before that, and I swear that I saw something or someone. I returned downstairs and locked everything again, triple checking and more deliberate this time. I moved my son into my arms and sat near the front of the house, away from the rear doors. I didn't hear anything else for several minutes after that, too. There was tapping on the glass at one point. It was light at first, intermittent, and close enough that I could tell that it was coming from the laundry door, not the fence or the shed. I stood up, unsure whether to move toward it or away from it. But before I could make that decision, the tapping turned into a single hard impact, like someone striking the glass with their hand. I woke my parents immediately after that. My dad, he got his gun and went outside while my mother called the police. The officers arrived within about 15 minutes and they checked the yard, the alley behind the property as well, and even the neighboring fences. They didn't find anyone, but they noted no damage to the doors or windows and told us that there was no physical evidence of any attempted entry. But what they couldn't explain was the tap, the unlocked doors, or why the motion sensor activated when it did. Over the following weeks, smaller things took place as well that added context rather than comfort. Like the basement light was found on despite the door remaining locked. A window screen from an unused room was discovered removed and leaning against the wall outside. None of these incidences were dramatic enough on their own to justify another police call, but together they created a pattern that was very difficult to ignore and certainly made us far more vigilant. Cameras were installed, locks were replaced. Nothing conclusive was ever recorded, but eventually I moved out. Now, there was no final confrontation, no arrest, and no definitive answers either. But the possibility, it was enough for me to move out, and I'm glad that I did at the time. All I can really hope is that that person is no longer nearby, because if they are, well, that's pretty creepy to think about. I was 21 at the time that this happened, and recently relocated. I had no social network there, and very little familiarity with the city outside of my commute. Recreational weed was not legal in the state at the time, and I didn't have established contacts either. And rather than exercising caution, I treated this as an inconvenience that I could solve by being direct with strangers. I know, not my brightest moment for sure. Most evenings after work, I spent time near a transit hub downtown where informal drug transactions were pretty common. The area was active enough that I assumed risk was pretty low, which, in hindsight, was a very bad assumption. I did not blend in either. I dressed casually, but noticeably differently from most of the people in that area, and I was clearly unfamiliar with the local norms. One night, though, in late October, shortly after 9 o'clock, I approached a man standing near a pedestrian underpass and asked if he knew where I could get some weed. He asked how much money I had, and I showed him a $20 bill. He told me that he could help, but said that the seller was not nearby. He suggested that I drive him to the location, and he said that he would guide me there. I agreed without considering alternatives. He directed me several miles east into a pretty rough-looking area, a residential one. The streets were pretty quiet here, with few occupied houses. He instructed me to park in front of a row of homes with boarded windows and wait while he went inside. I remained in the car for maybe 10 minutes, and during that time I considered leaving, but I didn't act on it. Partly because I was honestly unsure of my location now, and also because I assumed the money was already lost if I did. Eventually he returned and gestured for me to follow him inside. The interior of the house was pretty congested with discarded items everywhere. Movement through the space required stepping over a lot of debris. We entered a small room at the rear. There was another person present, an older woman seated on a mattress, facing a television displaying static. She didn't acknowledge my presence, and the man closed the door behind us and sat down. He produced a glass pipe and prepared it with a substance that was clearly not weed. He used it and then handed it to the woman, who did the same. When the pipe was offered to me, I declined and explained again that I was only looking for some weed. He raised his voice, though, and insisted. I assessed the situation and concluded that compliance would end the interaction faster than continual refusal. So I took the smallest possible inhalation that I could and avoided drawing it into my lungs altogether. Immediately afterward, I stood up and I exited without asking for my money back, and nobody attempted to stop me. I experienced numbness in my mouth and disorientation while driving away. I don't recall the route home clearly. I didn't return to that area again either, but despite this experience, I continued to make some pretty poor decisions. Several months later, in early spring, I was sitting in my car in a multi-level parking structure near my workplace after my shift ended. A woman approached from across the structure and asked for a ride. She appeared physically unwell but coherent. She said that she needed to get to a nearby street and indicated that it was a short distance away, so I agreed. After several turns, it became pretty apparent that she didn't know where she was going. Her speech became erratic, and when I told her that I needed to leave, she panicked and attempted to grab the steering wheel to redirect the car altogether. I stopped immediately and told her that she needed to get out. She reacted by placing her hands around my neck, though. The pressure was minimal, but the intent was pretty clear. I removed her hands and continued driving to avoid stopping in the area that we were already entering, which I recognized as an active open-air drug market. When I finally stopped, several men approached the car. One spoke to me directly and asked what I wanted, and I told him that I didn't know the woman and was just trying to leave. He entered the car without my permission, argued with her briefly, and then forcibly removed her and left her on the sidewalk. He then asked me to drive him to a nearby convenience store. And it was then that I noticed that this was the guy from earlier, the one who had forced me to smoke that night. I didn't recognize him at first because he looked so different, but it was him, I'm pretty certain of. At that point, my goal was to just end the situation without escalation, and so I complied, dropped him off, and gave him a little bit of cash that I had. I didn't want to see where it went too, so in the end I just left. I never reported anything because of how involved I was in the space at the time, but I know that it was stupid of me to do these things, and really, I got very, very lucky. That was sufficient enough reason for me to change my behavior eventually, and I had no interest in encountering any of these individuals again because, to be honest, if I had encountered them, I was pretty worried that they were going to either hurt me or maybe do something even worse. I was 16 years old at the time that this happened and living in a small coastal town. It was the kind of place where teenagers assumed that something familiar equaled safety, largely because serious incidents here were pretty rare and everyone believed that they knew everyone else too. That assumption, it shaped a lot of poor decisions really, including the one that set this situation in motion. So, a group of us had stayed overnight at a friend's house during holiday season, and late in the evening, after several hours of boredom and mild bravado, we decided to wander the neighborhood and play a few low-effort pranks. The plan was not organized by any means, and there was no agreed meeting point if something did go wrong, and I think that it was that lack of planning that mattered later the most. One of the houses we targeted responded immediately too. An adult came outside yelling, and the group scattered in different directions without any coordination whatsoever. Within seconds, I lost sight of everyone else too. I ran until I was confident that I was no longer being followed, then slowed down and tried to orient myself a bit. I didn't have a phone with me at the time, and I wasn't carrying any money or anything. After walking for roughly 10 minutes, I reached a small service station on a 2-lane road that connected to town to nearby farmland. It was just after midnight. The station itself was closed, but the forecourt lights were on, and I sat on a low concrete barrier near the pumps, and I tried to decide whether to wait there or start walking back toward my friend's house, which was several miles away now. While I was still considering my options, a compact utility vehicle pulled in and stopped closer to me than necessary. The vehicle was older and in poor condition. The driver was a young adult male, thin with no visible passengers. He didn't exit the vehicle either. He began asking questions immediately and without any introduction. He asked where I lived, why I was out so late, and who I was with, and whether my parents knew where I was. The questions were sort of delivered quickly and repeated when I didn't answer directly. His tone was not overtly aggressive or anything, but it was definitely insistent. I responded minimally and didn't provide any specific information. During the exchange, I noticed that he was holding an object near the steering wheel, though. I couldn't clearly identify what it was, but it resembled a phone positioned in a way that suggested that he may be recording or on a call or something. At that point, being a little bit weirded out by it, I decided that it was time to leave. I moved away from the forecourt and ran toward a scrub-covered drainage area behind the station. I heard the engine rev and saw the vehicle reposition toward the adjacent dirt access road that bordered the open land. I lay flat near a fence line and remained still. The vehicle's headlights swept the area and paused in my direction. I couldn't determine whether the driver saw me or was scanning generally, but after several minutes, the vehicle drove off toward the main road. Once the lights were gone, I waited longer than I thought necessary before moving again, and I avoided the main roads and walked through side streets and undeveloped lots, stopping whenever I heard approaching traffic. Eventually, I encountered 2 friends who had regrouped and were also trying to get back to the house, and together we returned without any further incident. Now, what was clear was that I was alone, underage, without a phone and stationary in a poorly monitored area pretty late at night, and that interaction was very, very weird. Whatever the driver's purpose was, the outcome was that I left safely in the end, which I was grateful for, but I'm pretty sure that his intent, that it was not good, and that I was actually in a fair bit of danger. This account was originally shared during a late-night call-in program on a regional radio station in southern Malaysia, where listeners were invited to recount unexplained experiences from earlier in their lives. The woman speaking identified herself as Naren and emphasized that, at the time of the events, she didn't believe in anything supernatural. She stated repeatedly that she still didn't, in fact, and that what occurred could be explained without invoking ghosts, but that it was strange nonetheless. More than a decade earlier, Naren was a university student living in a privately run student hostel. The building was old, poorly ventilated, and operated on minimal staffing. To reduce expenses, she shared a single room with another student, Liana, whom she knew only casually. They were not close friends, but coexisted without conflict, and Their schedules rarely overlapped. Naren worked evening shifts at a logistics office and typically slept during the day. Liana attended morning lectures and returned to the room early each night. According to Naren, Liana was withdrawn but functional, paid rent on time, and did not openly discuss personal issues, like ever. Several weeks before the incident, though, Naren accepted a temporary assignment in Penang that required her to stay away from the hostel for just over a week. Before leaving, Liana asked whether Naren would be comfortable being alone in the room afterward, as Liana planned to be away for a few days. Naren did not question this and assumed Liana meant visiting family or something. During the trip, Naren noticed Liana's social media activity continued as usual, and messages went unread, but that was not unusual given Liana's tendency to sort of disengage anyway. On the final night of the assignment, Naren attempted to call Liana to coordinate her return. The call went unanswered. When Naren returned to the hostel the following afternoon, Liana appeared to be present. She was seated at the desk, sorting papers. They exchanged brief conversation. Nothing about Liana's behavior stood out as abnormal. Naren showered, slept, and left for work later that evening, and at some point during the night, Liana left the room, stating that she needed to take care of something. The next morning, Naren woke up alone, and she noticed nothing unusual and left for breakfast at a nearby cafe like she usually did. And while there, she overheard staff discussing a persistent odor reported in one of the upper levels of the hostel. Naren didn't associate this with her room and didn't perceive any smell herself. Over the next 2 days, similar comments were made by other residents. One neighbor asked directly whether something had gone bad in Naren's room. Again, she detected nothing. Liana continued to appear in the room during evenings, engaging in brief, mundane interactions before leaving again. And on the 4th day, after Naren's return, the hostel owner arrived with a maintenance worker, stating that multiple complaints had been filed and an inspection was required. When the bathroom door was opened, the worker immediately exited the room and began retching. He even had to be assisted outside. Authorities were immediately contacted because the bathroom contained Liana's body. She had, unfortunately, ended her own life, and the decomposition was pretty advanced. The medical examiner later estimated the time of the death as approximately 10 to 12 days earlier, placing it within hours of Naren departing for Penang. Investigators recovered a handwritten notebook from Liana's belongings, outlining academic stress, financial strain, a recent breakup, and also an unplanned pregnancy. There was no indication that anyone else had been present in the room during the period in question, and so Naren was not a suspect. When questioned, though, Naren insisted that she had seen and spoken with Liana multiple times after returning. Police initially interpreted this as just shock-induced confusion. A psychiatric evaluation later suggested a dissociative response consistent with acute trauma exposure. The assessment concluded that Naren's brain likely suppressed awareness of the body upon initial discovery, substituting expected sensory information and routine behaviors in order to preserve basic functioning. Naren, though, stated that no such memory of discovering the body before the inspection, nor any recollection of unusual sights or smells during the intervening days, had ever occurred. She never accepted the medical explanation, too, and continued insisting that she had seen Liana just moments earlier. She moved out immediately after the investigation concluded and did not return to the hostel. Her reason for sharing the story was mostly confusion about what had happened and also the fact that she believed that she wasn't crazy. As far as she's concerned, she saw Liana and she was convinced that she was there. couple of years back, I was on a self-guided tour with my parents. The estate that we were in, it restricts access to upper floors, so visitors are routed through a limited number of rooms on the ground level. One of these rooms, it contains a large antique mirror that is often referenced in promotional material. I spent several minutes photographing that room, using 2 cameras, and it was a newer DSLR and an older mirrorless camera that I just keep as a bit of a backup. At the time the photos were taken, nothing appeared unusual. Lighting conditions were pretty poor, I'll admit, but consistent with the rest of the building. I moved on without reviewing the images. Now, maybe 20 minutes later, I noticed the older camera's battery indicator was pretty low. This was unexpected, as the battery had been charged the previous evening, and typically it lasts several hours at least. I assume the cold interior temperature, or maybe the age of the battery, was responsible and powered the camera off to preserve what remained. In any case, as I continued through the main hall near the front entrance, I felt something brush my neck and I heard a faint metallic sound. One of my earrings had fallen onto the floor. The backing was loose, but not visibly broken. I retrieved it and put it away rather than reattaching it. The estate's audio guide system operates through handheld devices triggered by proximity sensors, and I was wearing over-ear headphones connected to my phone and was not actively using the guide anyway. At one point, my father asked whether I intended to listen to the audio narration. When I removed my headphones, the guide device was playing information about a garment displayed in a room that I had already passed through earlier. I didn't recall activating it, but the device hangs at chest height and is known to trigger accidentally when visitors lean near displays. Later, while standing in a former sitting room, a staff member answered questions for a small group that I was sort of nearby. I mentioned the earring incident casually, and another visitor commented that small personal items were often reported as going missing during tours. This drew attention from several people nearby, and so the conversation briefly turned toward the estate's folklore. I explained what had happened without adding any interpretation. When I returned home that evening, I obviously reviewed the photographs, and several images from the older camera were just missing, and others showed heavy digital noise, motion blur, and shadow artifacts consistent with low light conditions and slow shutter speeds, I suppose. But the weirdest thing is that in one of the photos, there's like this huge dark mass. Now, while on a video call with a friend, I powered the old camera back on, and the battery indicator briefly showed a full charge before dropping back to critical within seconds. This behavior is consistent with failing batteries, which can display inaccurate readings due to voltage instability and all that. I later confirmed this too by testing the battery again the following day. It could not hold a charge and was disposed of in the end. But then, the earring backing that I picked up earlier was found later to be warped, almost like it was loosened earlier in the day without me noticing it. The audio guide device, when tested again, triggered easily when passing near certain displays, even without any deliberate input. And that's all I have to really report about it. Nothing further occurred after leaving the estate, and I didn't lose any items or anything, and no devices malfunctioned again once the battery was replaced. But what stood out to me the most is just how weird some of those photos are. In a neutral setting, none of these details would have really registered as significant at all, except for the black mass photo, of course, but in a location like this, they all felt pretty connected, to be honest. I haven't been back since then, but